You wake up in the same room every single day. Same walls, same door, same lock. You probably have a lease or a deed with your name on it. A piece of paper that says this square of the planet is yours and no one else's. That idea, a fixed place that belongs to you, feels so basic you've probably never questioned it. But for roughly 290,000 years, no human being on Earth had anything like it. No address, no property line, no key. You slept somewhere different depending on the season, the herd, the harvest of wild plants, and when you left a camp, you left it for good. The idea of staying in one place permanently was not normal. It had to be invented. And once it was, it didn't just change where people slept. It quietly created something that had never existed before. The idea that a thing or a place could belong to one person instead of everyone. For almost the entire span of the human story, resources moved, so people moved with them. Anthropologists who study surviving hunter-gatherer societies describe most of these groups as fiercely, almost aggressively equal. Meat gets shared the moment it's killed. Tools get lent out. Nobody accumulates a pile of anything, because a pile of anything is just extra weight on the next migration. There was no surplus to hoard, so there was very little to fight over and very little to inherit. That arrangement isn't a coincidence. It's what happens when your entire economy depends on movement. Then, around 14,500 years ago, something changed in the Hula Valley of northern Israel. At a site called Eynan, or Ain Mallaha, excavated starting in the 1950s by the French archaeologist Jean Perrot, people belonging to a culture called the Natufians began digging round. Semi-subterranean huts into the earth, with stone walls and hearths inside. This wasn't a seasonal stop. Archaeologists studying the site describe it as one of the first villages in human history. And here's the part that upends the standard story. These people were not farmers. They had no domesticated crops. They were still hunting gazelle and gathering wild grain by hand. They also happened to be living alongside the earliest evidence we have of domesticated dogs. People built permanent stone homes and buried their dead in decorated graves right next to where they lived, thousands of years before anyone planted a single seed on purpose. Here's something that doesn't make sense until you think about it. The standard assumption is that farming came first and settling down came after, because you'd need a food surplus before you could justify staying put. The Natufian evidence flips that order. Sedentism, the archaeological term for staying in one place, shows up before agriculture, not after. People chose to stop moving while they were still foragers, probably because the Hula Valley was so rich in wild food, fish, and water that walking away from it made less sense than staying and defending it. Roughly 6,000 years later, around 8,000 BCE, that choice to stay got a lot more serious. At Tel Sultan, the site of ancient Jericho, the British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon excavated a massive stone wall and built right against it a cone-shaped stone tower over 8 meters tall with an internal staircase of 22 steps. Estimates put the labor cost at well over 10,000 working days. That is not something a handful of families organizes on a whim. That's coordinated labor, on a scale that requires someone deciding who works, who eats, and who's in charge of the plan. A wall like that doesn't just keep danger out, it also, for the first time, draws a hard line around what's ours versus everyone else's. And once you're staying in one place long enough to build walls, something else becomes possible that was never possible on the move: storage. By around 7,000 BCE, at the enormous settlement of Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia, excavated originally by James Mellert and later by a long-term research project led by Ian Hodder, archaeologists found densely packed mud brick houses, some containing storage bins and large grinding stones called querns. Research into these households has found that homes held their own private property, even while some tools appear to have been communally shared, and that access to storage features and querns was not equal from house to house. In other words, some households at Çatalhöyük had more than others, not because they hunted better that week, because they had more grain stored from last year that nobody else could touch. This is where a completely different kind of thinker enters the story. In 1884, Friedrich Engels, working partly from notes left behind by Karl Marx, published a book called The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State. Drawing on the anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan's studies of indigenous societies like the Iroquois, Engels argued that early human communities operated under what he called a form of primitive communism. Not because they were morally superior, but because a mobile, share-everything economy was the only one that actually worked when nothing could be stored or defended. He argued that private property, in the modern sense, only becomes possible once a society produces a storable surplus, grain in a bin, herds in a pen, and that surplus is what eventually splits a community into people who control resources and people who don't. It's worth saying clearly, this is a theory, not a settled fact. and plenty of archaeologists and anthropologists since have pushed back on parts of it, arguing real prehistoric societies were messier and more varied than any single model captures. But the raw sequence at sites like Çatalhöyük, permanent homes, storable grain, and unequal storage between houses, lines up strikingly well with the mechanism Engels described a century before anyone had excavated the place. So here's the full picture. For 290,000 years, humans owned almost nothing because they carried everything, and sharing was survival, not virtue. Around 14,500 years ago, at Eynan, people started staying in one place before they even had farming. By 8000 BCE, at Jericho, staying in one place required organizing labor on a scale nobody had ever attempted before. By 7000 BCE, at Çatalhöyük, staying in one place had produced storable surplus, and that surplus was already sitting unevenly behind different mud brick walls. Now you complain about your mortgage rate. You get frustrated waiting for a landlord to fix a leaky faucet in a building you don't even own. Your ancestors spent nearly 300,000 years with no walls, no locks, and no leaky faucets, because they also had no concept that a room could belong to just one family in the first place. The wandering wasn't the strange part of human history. The staying was, and the moment we stopped moving is the same moment. Whether you read it through an archaeologist's trowel or a 19th century philosopher's notebook, that mine and yours became two different words.